Tightening its grip on Crimea, Russia takes another step towards reclaiming the Ukrainian region. The crisis is pitting national interests against international law. But who's to decide on sovereignty, secession, and self-rule? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. Vladimir Putin has defied the US and Europe to pave the way for Crimea to become part of Russia. In a televised address to the nation, the Russian president defended Crimea's vote as a restoration of historical justice. Crimea voted overwhelmingly to split from Ukraine in a referendum on Sunday. The two sides have now signed a treaty to incorporate Crimea into Russian territory. And Putin says he has no intention of seeking further division in Ukraine.
We don't want to damage you or violate your nationalistic feeling. We always respected your identity and sovereignty, especially those people who are saying that they are fighting for your rights. But they are the people who led the country to what it is now. Don't believe threats that after Crimea, other regions will follow. We don't want the division of Ukraine. We don't need it. Our partners, including the US, prefer not to follow international law, but the law of the strongest. They think about their exceptionality. They think they can decide the fate of the world. Only them. They act as they wish here and there. They just use their force against sovereign states. They build their politics. Who is not with us is against us.
Well, Fred Weir has more now from Moscow.
Well, history went into overdrive today in a very brief period of time, practically at lightning speed. Vladimir Putin recognized the independence of Crimea after its referendum on Sunday. And then this morning, he set in motion a rapid-fire train of events, the preparation of a draft treaty, an address to the joint houses of Congress, or of Parliament, and the signing of that treaty which formally made Crimea a part of Russia. So there will be a transition period of a few months until January the 1st to handle all the practical details of actually integrating Crimea with Russia, but it's a done deal. And now Russians are pleased. Putin had repeated standing ovations, and people in the street are almost rapturous about it. But in the days and months to come, people will wake up to the really difficult consequences and the changed world that today's events have brought about.
Well, to discuss all of this, let's bring in our guests. In Kiev, Mikhailo Winitsky, Associate Professor at the Kiev Moya Academy. Joining us on Skype from Moscow is Alexander Goltz, a political and military analyst and deputy editor of the online newspaper Daily Journal. And in The Hague, we have Olivia Ribelink, international and European law specialist and senior researcher at the TMC Asser Institute. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Alexander Goltz in Moscow. The move in Crimea clearly welcomed in Russia.
Yes, it is. A huge majority of Russian population agrees and admires what is going on. But let me say that it looks a little bit illogical that Mr. Putin said, okay, we'll take Crimea, but we will not advance to Kharkov or Donetsk region. Truly speaking, from Mr. Putin's logic, there is no difference between Kharkov's region, where the huge majority of population is Russians, as in Crimea, and Crimea itself.
Well,
At the same time,
we'll discuss those issues in a moment, Alexander Goltz, but I want to go straight to Mikhailo Winitsky. There was jubilation in Moscow, but certainly anger in Kiev, was there not?
Look, I'm not sure that anger is the correct word for it. I would say disappointment and exasperation would probably be the correct term. Just to correct my Russian colleague, the population, the ethnic population of all regions of Ukraine is majority Ukrainians, with the exception of Crimea. That's according to all census data that has been available for us for the last 20 years. So let's please, please, please not say that Kharkiv and Donetsk are exactly the same as Crimea. We'll get back to that, I'm sure. With respect to what's going on in Kyiv, look, people are to some extent, well, obviously disappointed, obviously exasperated. We've had a farce, not a referendum. It's become very clear now. We've had some figures come out from the official vote count in Crimea. Apparently 477,000 people in Sevastopol voted in the referendum. Well, the problem is that there are only 385,000 population of Sevastopol. So we have effectively 123% of people voting, and that includes children, apparently for reunification with Russia. This is not a genuine referendum. This has nothing to do with legality. This has nothing to do with anything that is legitimate. And people in Kyiv are basically looking at this and saying, well, what can we do? Exasperation is the feeling.
Well, Olivia Riverlink, we'll get into those precise details about the referendum itself in a moment. But the matter of principle, the issue here of the Crimea being reincorporated into Russia, as we heard from Vladimir Putin, that is the restoration of historical justice, as he puts it.
Yes, indeed, he did say so. And of course, the Crimea used to be a part of Russia and had been given to Ukraine in the 1960s, 50s, 60s. So yes, there's much to say that Crimea is actually, or should be part of Russia, Russian Federation. However, the way it has been organized, that is something else. That is something very different. And I'm certain that we'll come to talk about that later as well.
Well, Mikhailo Winitsky, I saw you shaking your head rather furiously there on that particular point.
I'm frustrated by the complete changing, rewriting of history. I mean, Crimea was apparently part of Russia. Well, you know what? I suppose Warsaw was part of Russia as well at one point. I mean, that doesn't mean that Russia has a claim on Poland. I mean, there's a lot of things that have happened in history with transfers of land back and forth, etc. I mean, India was part of England. So what? Does that mean that the British Crown has a claim to Delhi? Of course not. Crimea is a sovereign portion of Ukraine. Crimea is a part of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. One of the basic principles of international law is territorial integrity. It really doesn't matter what, where it was in history in previous times. Vladimir Putin's actions have, first of all, violated the territorial integrity of Ukraine. There's been an invasion of Ukraine, a military invasion by Russian forces. There's been a fraud of a referendum. He's completely canceled anything called the Budapest Memorandum, whereby Ukraine gave up voluntarily its nuclear weapons in 1994 under the sovereign guarantees of Russia to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. All of that is now out the window. And of course, this means that any kind of future negotiations with Iran, with North Korea, etc. I mean, if I were a leader of any country on the borders around Russia, I'd be arming with nuclear weapons right now, because quite frankly, there's really no reason not to.
Well, Alexander Goltz, there's a lot there, but I want to ask you specifically first the allegations about the referendum itself. The figures, apparently 96.77% of voters turned out. That was 83% turned out, 96.77 voted in favor. Those are very high figures. What do you say to claims that it was rigged?
Okay, truly speaking, I agree with my Ukrainian colleague. It's absolutely clear that this referendum has absolutely no legal base, because it was undertaken in situation when some kind of unknown military guys controlled all administrative buildings in Simferopol and all airports and all important points. Look, it was not free evaluation of rights of people. It's absolutely clear.
Well, Olivia Ribelink, we've heard already that word sovereignty a number of times. What has happened in the Crimea, does it undermine international concepts of sovereignty, the issue of sovereignty in terms of international law?
Well, of course it does. And I agree with much of what the gentleman in Kiev has just said. I just did not get round to elaborate on that after your first question. Yes, indeed. Apart from the question whether this referendum is legal or not, whether it's fraudulent or not, it's clear that it has been a referendum under sort of military pressure, foreign pressure. The fact that a part of a state organizes a referendum to decide or to make clear what they actually want is one thing, but the other thing is whether that can be accepted or not, or will be accepted by the state from which they want to secede as unilateral secession, whether it will be accepted by the international community. And in this case we have a very problematic issue indeed with, as the gentleman said in Kiev, the territorial integrity of Ukraine. All post-Cold War agreements, all major basic elements of the international legal order have been put under pressure here by one of the major powers. Now, of course, in international law, we have rules, we have rights and duties of states. And regrettably, but that's the reality, the major powers always have had a special position. That's in the structure of the United Nations Security Council, the 5 permanent members, and that's something that can be very little can be done about that. But it also puts at the same time a huge responsibility on those major powers, and in this case on Russia, which until recently, and I think President Putin in his speech of today hinted at that as well, that says always to attach such huge importance to the law and follow the law, as they said for example, with regards to Syria and the Syria situation. So I think this is a very dangerous precedent, and I agree with the position that, and I can imagine very well, that other states in the region, Moldova, the Baltic states and others, are very, very worried now.
But some critics contend, though, that decisions are taken in the basis of national interest. Let's just pause here and take a look at a little bit of background. A number of countries have sought independence in recent years with varying levels of support. Kosovo is a case in point, but does it serve as a precedent? Kosovo was an autonomous republic where ethnic Albanians said they lived in fear of Serbian repression. Crimea is also largely self-governed, with many ethnic Russians now worried about newly empowered Ukrainian nationalists. Kosovo managed to gain independence with the help of NATO forces and US approval. Russia insists the situation in the Crimea is the same, but points out that this time the US is not supporting secession.
The US has used its force against sovereign states to build their politics. The US says Kosovo is a unique case. But why is it so special? This is not just double standards, it's primitive and straightforward cynicism. You can't change everything to suit your own interests. You can't call something black one day and the same thing white the next.
Well, Mikhailo Winitsky in Kiev, your reaction to that statement by Putin that it's not level playing fields?
Then my question to Mr. Putin is, why didn't you recognize the referendum in Kosovo? It's an interesting thing. I mean, you're talking about double standards. Russia does not recognize the independence of Kosovo, and at the same time is requiring the rest of the world to recognize this annexation of Crimea to Russia. There is a double standard, if you ask me. But I think that one of the most important things is when you're talking about Putin's statement in his press conferences and his actions, the two don't jive. Clearly, there's a double standard, and when he says that eastern Ukraine is not under threat, I will say that an awful lot of people in Kyiv today do not believe him. Kyiv is on a war footing, very much defensive war footing, but nevertheless, we have mobilization, we have reservists being called up, troops being moved to the eastern borders. We expect an invasion of Ukraine or some sort of other form of hostility literally within the next 6 to 10 days. This Crimean situation is far from over.
Well, Alexander Goltz, your reaction to that? That's a very serious allegation, invasion of Ukraine within 6 to 10 days, your view?
Look, again, it's a very difficult question. Shall we analyze Mr. Putin from a rational point of view or irrational? Unfortunately, there are very few reasons to analyze all what's going on from a rational point of view. So for me as military analyst, there is no another option but to analyze this way. Look, the massing of Russian troops on Ukrainian borders is not enough for invasion. You should understand that it will be totally different operation that was undertaken in Crimea. It was enough, because of geography, it was enough to cut Crimea from other Ukraine with few hundred men. But it's totally different when we speak about invasion in Ukraine, in other parts of Ukraine. So in any case, you have to stabilize border between these new Russian regions and other Ukraine. So you have to move, in my estimation, not less than 100,000, maybe 100,000 and 150,000 troops. So it doesn't look that Mr. Putin is going to do so.
Well, Mikhailo Winitsky, you wanted to say something there.
Yeah, just so that we understand, according to the intelligence reports that the Ukrainian government is currently issuing, we're looking at 80 to 85,000 troops on the Russian side that have already been mobilized. And that's the massing of troops that we're talking about at the moment. Clearly, that is not enough to invade all of Ukraine, but it's not a question of all of Ukraine. It's a question of taking off a bite at a time. Clearly, I mean, Crimea is not all of Ukraine. Crimea was a little bite. And we're talking about the eastern regions, which, quite frankly, and not the southern regions for the moment, just the eastern regions. I mean, in either case, look, we're not going to be talking about how much is going to be bitten off. We're talking about the very principle of a sovereign country attacking another sovereign country and openly showing aggression for the sake of protecting not its own nationals or citizens, but for the sake of protecting people that are Russian speakers. Now, the last time that we had that sort of a justification used for invasion, I remind you, was Sudetenland and Hitler.
Well, yes, but in the interest of fairness there, if I may just point to a statement by Vladimir Putin that in terms of a treaty signed with Ukraine, Russia did have the rights to have 25,000 troops stationed in its Black Sea ports. So there is, he would argue, a legitimate treaty with Ukraine that provided for that.
Excuse me. There's a legitimate treaty providing for American troops in Guantanamo as well. That doesn't mean that American troops, armed to the teeth, can walk around Havana. I mean, there's a difference between Sevastopol and the rest of Crimea. What Russian troops have done is occupy all of Crimea, not just the port of Sevastopol.
Well, on that particular point, I want to go to Olivia Ribelink here. The issue of precedent. Now, some are arguing that having done this, there could be pressure from Chechnya, for example. Chechnya pointing to what is happening in Crimea and saying, oh, we want to secede from Russia. Now, in terms of the logic that is being exercised here, that should be allowed to happen, should it not?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, all these situations are, as always, rather different. And you see that in every situation, the argumentation that is being put forward, in this case even by Russia, which felt obliged to put forward international legal arguments while their actions were justified, these situations are always different. I like the example of Guantanamo because indeed it's a good example. It's a sort of a lease. That's a very, again, a different situation, but they're confined to that area. I do not know exactly the conditions of the agreement between Russia and Ukraine about Sevastopol, but I tend to agree with the gentleman from Kiev that that is the most obvious and likely. Other situations are different. In Kiev, there was, for example, there was no force, no violence against the Russians in Crimea. In Kosovo, for example, that situation was entirely different. There was a continuing use of force against the Albanian population. So there's a very different situation, and of course Chechnya will be again a different situation. The problem is that the danger is the precedent of foreign powers, especially major powers, interfering in the internal situations of sovereign states. And that, of course, I must admit that Mr. Putin, of course, does have a point that in the past other major powers, such as the United States, have done similar things, albeit with different justifications.
Well, Alexander Goltz, I want to go back to that point that has been brought up now a couple of times, the contention that this is just the beginning, that what is happening in terms of Russia's activities is eyeing a far greater field than purely Crimea. This is just the first step in a wider strategy of Russian domination, some fear.
Look, few recent weeks, all those who tried to predict something about Mr. Putin's behavior failed. All of us, including American intelligence, for example, predicted that Russia will not try to take over Crimea. Next, everybody predicted that Russia will not undertake some kind of annexation of Crimea. We also failed. So, in my mind, we are Russians, and Mr. Putin himself are on the level of hysteria that we can hardly predict the future steps of him.
Well, Mikhailo Winitsky, the response that we have seen, well, sanctions imposed on 11 individuals. That seems to be the sum of attempts by the EU, NATO, and the US in terms of waving a stick back at Vladimir Putin. That's not very hopeful for the people of the Ukraine, is it?
Well, it's not, and realistically, I think that the sanctions that have been put on to Russia will probably have a long-term effect rather than a short-term effect, and it's very difficult to fight against military aggression with sanctions. Clearly, there has been an aggression. There will continue to be aggression, which is, I mean, what I think is the main message coming out of Ukraine today. As my colleague in Moscow said very correctly, it's very difficult to predict the unpredictable Putin. He's not acting rationally. He's not acting according to rules. So therefore, Ukrainians are preparing for the worst. I will say that there has been a request from Ukraine for a no-fly zone to be instituted by NATO over Ukraine. That request has not been answered. We haven't received a yes or a no. Ukrainians are definitely preparing for a refugee situation from Crimea. One thing that we have not mentioned in this program is the fact that there are 300,000 Crimean Tatars in Crimea who boycotted the referendum. They have absolutely no desire to live under Russia. At the same time, Crimea is their ancestral homeland. They are very much fearful of what is going to happen now that Crimea has de facto become part of Russia. And they're fearful of both persecution on both religious grounds and on ethnic grounds. If we see some sort of form of ethnic cleansing, that would be the worst case scenario at the moment.
Well, Olivia Ribelink, very quickly, is there anything in terms of international law that can be done to rectify the situation, or is law merely an impotent weapon in this type of situation?
International law is, of course, not very strong in itself, and it is in particular weak faced with major powers going their own way, because they're very difficult to stop and to turn around. That's the problem. But generally speaking, I fear that after the 20th century, when we talked about German revanchism after the First World War, we were now faced with Russian revanchism after the breakup of the Soviet Union. I think that's a very worrying situation.
Well, at that point, my thanks to our guests, Mikhailo Winitsky, Alexander Goltz, and Olivia Ribelink. And do let us know your thoughts. Join in the debate on Facebook or Twitter. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.